Good morning, and welcome to day 53 of F260 at First Baptist Meridian. Today we look at Deuteronomy chapters 1 and 2. And before we get to those chapters specifically, a little bit about Deuteronomy to put the book in context. Deuteronomy is the fifth book of the Bible, but it's also the final book of the first section of the Bible, sometimes referred to as the Torah or law, or sometimes you hear it called the Pentateuch. 5 books that function largely as one story. A God who creates everything there is, the heavens and the earth, and when that creation goes awry, begins this redemptive plan and process by making a covenant with the people who become Israel. The key event of deliverance in the Old Testament is God taking an entire nation of Israelites out of Egypt and into the promised land. But over the last several weeks, we've seen that's not so simple. God has bigger plans for them than they'll accept for themselves. And despite all the times that God shows them exactly how good he desires to be to them, they often disbelieve or outright rebel against him. And so that really came to a head in Numbers 13 and 14 when God had brought them to the cusp of the promised land the first time, and they refused to go in on the basis of the report from 10 of the 12 spies. So God allowed an entire generation to perish in their unbelief in the wilderness. That's so much of what Numbers was about. On the other side of Deuteronomy, we'll enter the book of Joshua, where the conquest of the promised land finally happens. And so Deuteronomy stands at the end of this first big section, the Torah, and it stands firmly between the action of the book of Numbers and the action that we'll find in the book of Joshua. So why is the narrative slow down so much? Why is this entire book dedicated to such a brief period of time? And that's where we have to look at some important transitions that are going on. First of all, this book serves, again, as a deuteronomos, a second iteration of the law or the covenant. The generation that was at Mount Sinai has died out, and a new generation has come about. And so before they go into the land, they need to have an awareness of their constitution, their covenant with God. So Deuteronomy functions as something of an extended covenant renewal. Second, it serves as an exposition of the law, particularly the Ten Commandments. And a lot of scholars will note how large blocks or sections of the book of Deuteronomy really serve to expound those 10 commandments over most of the course of the book. And finally, Deuteronomy serves as something of a farewell address for Moses. Again, Moses is this unparalleled leader in the Old Testament. He spoke face to face with God, it is said in Exodus 33, as a man speaks to a friend. And yet Moses got caught up in the grumbling and the disbelief of that wilderness generation. And you had that pivotal scene that we looked at in Numbers 20, when Moses, rather than speaking as his most important role, rather than speaking to the rock, he struck it twice. And on the basis of that, God said that Moses himself would not get to enter into the land of promise. And so, of course, we saw the rise of Joshua. And so the book of Deuteronomy ends, interestingly, with the death of Moses. But in the meantime, Moses is speaking to the Israelites. As you know, his initial role becomes primary once again in the book of Deuteronomy. And there are 3 main speeches that he gives to the people. The first begins at chapter 1, verse 5. The second begins at chapter 4, verse 49. And the third begins at chapter 29, 1. And after these 3 speeches, Moses looks out from Mount Nebo onto the promised land that he will not get to enter. And then the book records the death of Moses. So very importantly, if you read the first 2 chapters of Deuteronomy, you notice that they are overwhelmingly concerned with reiterating the story of deliverance from God taking his people out of Egypt to the cusp of the promised land, his faithfulness, and sometimes their failure to follow through. Why is that so important? Because again, the Old Testament law gets such a bad reputation as this system of rules and regulations. And while there are rules and regulations and commandments, it is fundamentally about a story, the story of a God who delivers us from something to something. a God whom we can trust in anything he calls us to do on the basis of what he has already done, a God who we can believe when he tells us all that we can be on the basis of all that he's already been for his people. So notice as you read the first two chapters of Deuteronomy, especially through the second half of the first half of the second chapter, that it's largely a reiteration in a compact form of the story to this point. And never let yourself forget that the story drives the system. That underneath every "thou shalt" is an underlying basis of who God has been and what God has done, and that's so important for us to remember today. Everything that we do as believers is already in response to something God has done. Everything we are called to be is in response to something God has already been. So we'll unpack this more as we look at the book of Deuteronomy in days to come. But in the meantime, keep reading, keep reflecting, and keep responding to God's word. And may he bless you as you do so. I'll see you tomorrow.